everybody, and welcome. We're right on the dot, 11 o'clock, so we'll get going because, as you've probably figured out over the last few days, these sessions always run right to the brink. We've got 2 hours this morning, moving through the early afternoon, to talk about, I guess, net positive impact, and to, I guess, try and achieve 2 goals. Give you an overview of where we've been to on the last sort of 4 years, or actually 8 years of our journey around the net positive impact piece. To give you a flavour of that, and then to, I guess, shift the discussion a little bit into, I guess, the higher strategic issues around net positive impact, and we'll use the panel to do that, and take us through, I guess, some of the barriers and enablers, and try and have a very open and free-flowing discussion with you guys in the audience, because, of course, as stakeholders and all this, you know, your opinions and views are critically important. So my name's Stuart Anstey. I'm the Chief Advisor, Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services for Rio Tinto. I'm your host for today, so just welcome officially. We've brought together a number of people to go through, I guess, this technical presentations first, and then the workshop and the panel discussion secondly. This is who we're involving today. So in terms of, I guess, the technical presentations, I'll start this off giving you, I guess, a higher viewpoint of, I guess, the biodiversity strategy and Rio Tinto's approach. John Ekstrom from the Biodiversity Consultancy will then follow up to, I guess, for the techies amongst us to get into the real nuts and bolts in a very quick way. And then we'll then finish off the presentations and with Tom Brooks from NatureServe, who will talk about, I guess, some of the work that we've been doing just recently with the IUCN process. And I won't name the panellists now. Josh Bishop will take over as moderator from me and lead the panellists through a series of discussions, about an hour and 25 minutes to an hour and a half. So we want to leave plenty of time for that discussion at the end. And hence I'll try and work through this fairly quickly to bank a little bit of time. Just to recap, I guess, I'm assuming that most of you know who Rio Tinto is. We're a diversified mining company, one of the biggest in the world. We operate pretty much on every continent of the world, have 110 so operations across those continents. The issue of, I guess, this for us is critically important. It's exceptionally material. We, I guess, try and encapsulate it most quickly as looking to maintain our license to operate, because access to new resources are critically important for the value of the company in the long term. So the biodiversity strategy piece and our commitment to a net positive impact on biodiversity are really focused about maintaining that license to operate, to provide our businesses and our operations with the tools they need to address biodiversity and conservation issues at those sites. And there are just a number of different elements in terms of that business case. Because we're having to go through this fairly quickly in terms of the technical presentations, there are 3 publications that we're actually almost launching today. An ebook which gives you a very deep dive into the history of the whole biodiversity strategy, starting from actually pre-2004 through the policy development era around 2004 to 2008. The methodologies after that, and where we are currently with the implementation. And there's a number of, this is a live book on the website, and it's linked to numerous case studies and other technical documents. One being this action planning piece that I'll talk about a little bit further, and I guess something that's been waiting for a long time, one of our first substantive pieces around doing the NPI accounting for the QMM project in Madagascar, and I think this is a pretty hot little item at the Congress here. It seems to be going off the shelves pretty quickly. Just to recap, because there's been a number of discussions about this already, the whole NPI piece, or the net positive impact element for Rio Tinto and the biodiversity strategy, is underpinned by what we call the mitigation hierarchy. And I'm sure that all of you in the room have seen various versions of this through different organisations. But it's fundamentally important to the whole basis. It's a way of making sure that we're not focusing on 1 or 2 aspects, and we're trying to manage biodiversity right throughout the project phase, from avoidance at the early stages of project design through to compensation measures around offsets and what we might call additional conservation actions at the back end of those. So this piece, and John will talk more about this and give you a practical example of that, is critical to the whole thing. It underpins the whole concept of NPI for us. the policy piece for us is what you might call an end-to-end framework, where we have the policy sitting at the highest level, so the commitment around net positive impact. And if you want to boil that down into one statement, it's about really trying to deliver conservation gain in the regions that we work. We're looking at that. We have a series of tools and methodologies that sit within that. Underneath that sort of broad external commitment, we have an internal target that looks specifically at this point in time at the issue of action planning at operations, and I'll just talk briefly about that in just a second. And then what we've done is, I guess, we've underpinned the whole thing with a set of principles on, firstly, net positive impact in the first place, but then a subset of principles around the issue of biodiversity offsetting in the second place. And I think that's where we sort of, I guess, feel that it's important to have those principles at this stage in the development of the MPI framework and the biodiversity strategy, to make sure that we've got some governing framework to say what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. We've had numerous discussions with our stakeholders, both internally and externally, about the issue of standards. And at this point in time, I guess it's our views that they're probably a little bit premature, with there's still a lot of learning to do in terms of how this is applied at an operational level to be successful. And that the early intervention or generation of standards could potentially lock you into a pathway which might not be adaptive in the real world. So that's why I guess we've decided to take the principles approach, and then Tom will talk about the back end of that, which is the governance piece we're currently working on with the IUCN. And I guess it's our view at the moment that those two fit quite nicely. Underneath all that, and John will start and kick us off on this, we've got a whole series of tools and methodologies that we've been developing over the last 8 years. And I guess I spoke at a WBCSD function last night, the happy hour, and I'll re-stress the point that in the development of these, we've relied incredibly heavily on engagement with external stakeholders, and there's a number of organisations in the room here today that have really played a critical part in the development of that. They've brought the conservation world into this thinking, and what we've done is then applied that to our business context. And I think this Biodiversity Action Planning piece here is a really good example of how we've taken and worked with FFI, the Biodiversity Consultancy, Hardner & Gullison in the US, and numbers of other organisations to take conservation actions and measures and methodologies and apply those to a framework that fits within our operational context. Because if we don't do that as a first principle, it's incredibly hard to take this through the operations and the businesses. Two key points, and I'll use this as a segue into John's piece, is that we're obviously looking at prioritising our actions and our efforts over time. So we have what we call the Global Biodiversity Values Assessment, and we use that as a first filter across all of the group to draw out those that sit within incredible or high or very high biodiversity context areas. And that's our focal point. And at this point in time, that's 27 operations across the group. And we draw upon I guess, the standard IUCN tools and that in terms of the protected areas database, the IUCN red list, and then national list, and then build up, I guess, a profile of what operations sit within high and very high biodiversity context and others that don't, and we're focusing at that top end. And then we're using the Biodiversity Action Planning process, this book that I just spoke about, as the primary framework to deliver the biodiversity strategies and ultimately the MPI piece, the MPI goals at those operations. And on that, I'll hand over to John.
Thanks very much, Stuart. So I think many of us from the sessions in the past 2 days really want much more participation from the floor. So we're going to try and keep this all as short as possible. I'm in, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm in trouble here because Claire Verburn is there at the back. I'm going to be cracking the horsewhip if I go over 10 minutes, so I'll try to keep this to time. So this is a very brief introduction, overview of MPI metrics and net positive impact accounting. We're assuming a certain level of knowledge. Most of these talks tend to be underpitched, so if there are any questions, please get back to me afterwards. Many of you work in biodiversity conservation. Like conservation planning, Rio Tinto faces the same constraints. Biodiversity is enormous and interconnected. How do you measure it? How do you manage it? Not everything can be managed and measured. There's genes to ecosystems, etc. Rio Tinto's approach is to use the precedents in conservation biology of such as pressure state response indicators, and also a strict standardized prioritization system using vulnerability and irreplaceability as the tenets of conservation biology. We've developed a set of flexible metrics based around the extent and condition of habitat and the proportion of species global population sizes. And in particular, no aggregated indices or metrics are used. We use like an accounting system, one accounting line per biodiversity feature. So this provides a transparent way for stakeholders to inspect the data that's available for each site. Don't get the impression that MPI, net positive impact metrics and accounting is the whole story. The main management tool in Rio Tinto is Biodiversity Action Planning, which Stuart has just gone over. So the Biodiversity Action Plan is the overall assessment and the adaptive management tools for risks and impacts, and the NPI metrics simply inform some of the adaptive management in the Biodiversity Action Plan. NPI metrics are focused on what we call state indicators. So many of you will be aware that there's also pressure and threat indicators which are necessary for full metrics and management. These are also incorporated in the Biodiversity Action Plan. So MPI metrics and the accounting system cover the highest priority biodiversity features, such as the most important species, most important habitats, and they're part of a feedback mechanism to improve performance in the back process. So much of this talk as an overview. If you want more detail, go into the publication that Stuart's shown at the beginning, which is the first large field study conducted 2.5 years ago at QMM, Madagascar. It's a Rio Tinto ilmenite site in southeast Madagascar. This is a best practice example of the prioritization of biodiversity values at a site, the application of a mitigation hierarchy, avoidance, minimization, restoration, and offsetting, and the quantitative measurement of loss gain through the mitigation hierarchy. So the same fungible metrics are used for measuring the losses, measuring the gains through avoidance, minimization, restoration, and offsetting. Those are for species, different species, and different habitats. It also has a section on stakeholder engagement and how an expert panel and local stakeholders are involved in assessing the validity of the no net loss accounting. Rio Tinto uses the 6-step method to do net positive impact accounting. And put very simply, first of all, it's a matter of prioritizing the biodiversity to include in the assessment using tenets of conservation biology, giving recession results such as certain species and certain ecosystems that to take into account. Next, selecting metrics appropriate to those types of biodiversity, such as quality hectares, habitat hectares, or species population size. Thirdly, and this is critical, you have to decide the time period over which you measure the losses and gains. So Rio Tinto made a commitment to net positive impact in November 2004 at the WCC conference in Bangkok. That's the time from which, that's the baseline if you like, from which all gains or losses are measured. So to calculate, if you do it today, 2012, you can retrospectively measure the gains and losses from 2004 to 2012. But we've gone beyond that to do forecasting, to assess the impacts of a mine from 2004 all the way up to, say, mine closure in 2065. One of the main benefits of doing that is you can predict the amount of investment required in restoration or in offsetting to reach net positive impact by mine closure, which is what Rio Tinto's target is. Number 4 is to apply the mitigation hierarchy, avoid, minimize, restore, and then quantify the residual losses using the appropriate metrics. You might come up with 300 hectares of forest or 40 pairs of bird for all the different values. Fifthly, you then need to quantify the gains to be generated through offsets to compensate for these residual losses. Then the last stage is what we call an exchange mechanism or exchange model, where lots of different issues involved in the great no net loss debate that many of you will be aware of are taken into account. So considering uncertainty and risk, time discounting, like for not like exchanges, etc. So not all these things are necessarily taken into account in each assessment, but this is where all the knotty issues of no net loss are taken into account. Prioritising biodiversity, very simply, in the Biodiversity Action Plan, we've divided it mainly into species, habitats and sites, and ecosystem processes, and then looked at it top row, whether it's valuable, the biodiversity is valued intrinsically, or whether it's in terms of an ecosystem service. So for species, you have food, fibre, fuel; for habitats and sites, for ecosystem services, hunting and fishing sites; ecosystem processes, things like air quality regulation. So the MPI verification so far is really working on these top two, the species and habitats intrinsic values of this table. So the metrics are well developed for species and habitats, but they're still in development for ecosystem services. The habitat metrics, the main habitat metric we've developed is called quality hectares. It's been developed in partnership with a number of regional biodiversity partners. Essentially, 100 hectares of forest at optimum quality, pristine quality, is 100 quality hectares, whereas if it's degraded to about 50% quality, that's 50 quality hectares. This is called an extent, so there's a picture of 1 quality hectare of forest versus half a quality hectare of forest. This is a type of extent times condition metric, which is used by many governments around the world. It's used by most of the Australian state governments. It's been used by BBOP. The Business and Biodiversity Offsets Programme and lots of its projects. It's well accepted as a useful way of measuring impacts on habitats. The devil is in the details of how you estimate the quality in QH, in quality hectares. This is a science and stakeholder consultation process. You essentially compare your site against a benchmark of 100% quality, a pristine site. Significantly, Rio Tinto has not developed any one single method to measure the quality in quality hectares. In some cases, regulators may provide the required method. So New South Wales has a biometric, Victoria has a vegetation assessment system. Or in some cases where there's no method available, we have developed custom-built methods such as described in that document that's at the back. For species, several of our staff at the consultancy have come from IUCN and worked on IUCN red listing. So we used some of the IUCN knowledge products, such as the IUCN red list, to develop metrics for species. The species metric is called units of global distribution. These are needed where quality hectares are a poor surrogate for species. So if you can't really measure the impacts on species through measuring quality and area of habitat. 1 unit of global distribution, UD, is equivalent to 1% of the species' global population size or the occupied distribution of the species. So often IUCN uses something called area of occupancy to measure as a surrogate for the global population size of the species. UD is particularly useful as it gives an idea of the scale of losses and gains relative to the total global population. These kinds of metrics are the UD approach is used in other recognized standards and metrics, such as this is Langhammer et al., the Key Biodiversity Areas publication. Loriconzo and the IFC have used similar approaches in critical habitat, etc. So, a brief deep dive into how you might calculate this. If the red blob is an impact area, this is Sierra Leone Crimea, Virgin West Africa, you would measure the area of occupancy known globally and then work out the percentage which is taken up by the impact area. These then metrics for each individual bird species are run through the mitigation hierarchy to assess the losses and gains using that metric. Claire is now waving at me. Is that 10 minutes? Okay. Net positive impact accounting. So it's carried out at the site level. It includes impact sites and offset sites. All losses and gains are accounted for. The goal is net positive impact by closure, but the aim is to achieve this as early as possible. It's the new application of existing science to quantify losses and gains. and provides the principal information for the external review that Tom is going to talk about. So it's a science-based assessment, it's transparent and verifiable, and a planning tool for the MPI programme. Significantly, as I said, it also provides the financial investment information required for mitigation and offsets into the future. So it also is a business planning tool to work out the required financial investments for MPI. So it uses disaggregated accounting sheets. I've got an example, because aggregated metrics don't really satisfy stakeholders or science. And here we have an example from the publication at the back. So as you can see, each individual species has there's the global range there in hectares, taken from the IUCN Red List, the net impact, excluding or including potential for restoration, and then an assessment at the end of whether MPI is likely to be achieved by mine closure. You can see this graphic in the diagram. The red, this is an example of littoral forest in southeast Madagascar from 2004 to 2065. The red bar there going up is the impacts of the mine, and the other coloured bars are the gains predicted to occur from the mitigation hierarchy. I won't go into this in detail then, if we run out of time. These are how to apply the rules of fair exchange, taking into account the precautionary principle, uncertainty and risk, and the background rates of loss to calculate converted loss gains for the offsets. Final slide that really